They say the greatest betrayals are the ones that come from within the walls you built yourself, that the deepest wounds are carved by the hands you used to hold. But what they don't tell you is that the person you become after the storm is stronger than anyone you were before. This isn't the story of how my marriage ended. This is the story of how I began. My world was a beautiful, intricate castle built on the foundation of a loyalty I believed was absolute. I was the devoted wife, the steadfast partner, one half of an us that felt as certain as the sunrise. We had our rituals. The way he'd hand me my coffee in the morning without asking, the shared glances across a crowded room that said everything, the future we'd mapped out on 1,000 napkins over late-night dinners. It was a comfortable, safe existence, a life insulated by the warmth of our shared history. But a shadow began to creep in at the edges, so subtly at first that I dismissed it as a trick of the light. It was a change in the atmosphere, a quiet hum of wrongness that I couldn't quite place. It was in the silences that stretched just a second too long, filled with unspoken words that hung heavy in the air between us. It was in the smiles that he gave me, smiles that were technically perfect, but never quite reached the tired, distant look in his eyes. And then there was the phone. His phone, which had once been a shared piece of our landscape, became a fortress. It was always turned face down on the table, a silent, dark sentinel guarding its secrets. A casual touch from me would cause him to flinch. A notification would have him snatching it up with a speed that was jarring. My intuition, a primal, deep-seated part of me, was screaming. It was a physical sensation, a knot tightening in my stomach, a cold dread that would wash over me at the most random moments. But my hope, that stubborn, foolish hope, was a constant whisper in my ear. He's just stressed from work. We're in a rut. All couples go through this. Don't be paranoid. Don't rock the boat. I chose to listen to the whisper, because the scream was too terrifying to acknowledge. The truth it was screaming would mean the end of my world, and I wasn't ready to face that. Not yet. The discovery wasn't a single, dramatic explosion. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, torturous unraveling of the life I thought I knew. It started with a credit card bill I opened by mistake. A charge for a dinner at a restaurant we'd never been to, on a night he said he was working late. When I asked, the lie was so smooth, so practiced, it almost convinced me. It was a client dinner, he said, not missing a beat. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Then came the straight text message that flashed on his car's dashboard while we were driving. Just a name, a woman's name, followed by a heart emoji. He saw that I saw it. The air in the car turned to ice. "It's just a colleague," he mumbled, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "She's just like that." Another lie, another brick pulled from the foundation of our life. Each lie was an insult to my intelligence, a dismissal of our shared history. I started to look back, re-examining months, even years, of memories through this new, sickening filter. The late nights at the office, the business trips on weekends, the sudden need for privacy. It was a double life, running in parallel to mine, and the signs had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. I had just refused to see them. The final blow, the moment the castle crumbled into the sea, wasn't the discovery of the affair itself. It was the confession. I finally confronted him, armed with undeniable proof, my voice shaking but my resolve firm. I expected tears, apologies, begging. I expected a fight for us. What I got was a cold, clinical summary. He sat across from me in our living room, the room where we had hosted holidays and dreamed of our future, and he laid it all out with the detached air of a man closing a business deal. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a weary relief, the relief of being unburdened of the secret. And that's when he delivered the cruelest truth. He didn't just say he was leaving me for her, he explained new Noxbucax. He talked about her as if she were a new model, full of exciting features he'd been missing. He talked about her energy, her spontaneity, her fresh perspective. And with every word, he was talking about me. He was describing everything I wasn't. I was the old model. Reliable, familiar, but ultimately obsolete. The concept of the asterisk trade-in, asterisk, became brutally, inhumanly real. I wasn't the love of his life being left behind. I was a product being exchanged for a newer, better version. The pain of the betrayal was immense, but the feeling of being devalued, of being reduced to an object that was no longer wanted, was a poison that seeped into my very soul. In that moment, sitting in the ruins of my life, I was nothing. I was the echo of a broken promise, the ghost of a woman he used to love. The decision to leave was the single most terrifying act of my life. For a few days after the confession, I existed in a state of suspended animation. I walked through our house, a home that was no longer mine, touching the furniture, the photographs, the artifacts of a life that was a lie. Part of me wanted to stay and fight, to claw and scream and demand that he see what he was throwing away. But I looked at him, and I saw a stranger. The man I loved was gone, and in his place was someone who had calculated my worth and found it lacking. To leave meant tearing down the castle with my own two hands, piece by piece, with no new shelter in sight. It meant stepping out into a storm without a coat. It meant facing the crushing, suffocating fear of the future. The nights were the worst. The silence in the bed was a physical presence, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I was terrified of the loneliness, of the quiet judgment in the eyes of friends and family, of the pity. But worst of all, I was terrified of facing the ghost of my own failure. Where did I go wrong? Why wasn't I enough? The questions were a relentless chorus in my head. Packing my life into boxes was a form of torture. Every object held a memory now tainted by betrayal. The souvenir from our first trip together, the blanket we used to curl up under on the couch, the wedding album. I sealed each box like a coffin. The day I left, I stood at the door and took one last look at the life I had poured my heart into. Walking away from it felt like walking away from a part of my own body. It was an amputation, but it was also the first, most courageous step towards saving myself. The first few months were a blur of grief and pure survival. I found a small apartment that felt cold and empty. The silence was deafening. I was navigating an ocean of pain, and most days, I was just trying to keep my head above water. Simple tasks felt like monumental efforts. Going to the grocery store was an ordeal, navigating the aisles filled with happy couples, feeling their imagined stares on my back. Cooking a meal for one felt pathetic. I'd cry at random moments, in the car, in the middle of a workday, in the shower. I had to look in the mirror and confront the woman I had become, a hollowed-out version of myself, a figure diminished by another shadow, a victim of the trade-in. I didn't recognize her, and I didn't like her. But it is from the deepest, darkest ashes that the phoenix is reborn. The change didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment of grand epiphany. It began with small, deliberate acts of defiance against the sadness. One day I was scrolling through my phone and saw an ad for a beginner's dance class. The old me, the us me, would have dismissed it. But a tiny voice inside said, "Just go." So I did. I was clumsy and awkward. But for 1 hour, as I focused on the steps and the music, I wasn't thinking about him. I was just moving. I was just me. That small act opened a door. I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who knew me before I was a we. We had coffee, and we laughed. A real, genuine laugh that came from my belly. It felt like a foreign sound, and it was beautiful. I started filling the enormous void he had left behind, not with a replacement, but with pieces of myself I had long forgotten. I rediscovered my love for reading, spending hours lost in bookstores. I started hiking on weekends, finding a sense of peace and strength in nature that I never knew I needed. I took a solo trip to a small coastal town where no one knew my name or my story. The first night was terrifying. I ate dinner alone, feeling intensely self-conscious. But by the third day, I was exploring with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in a decade. I was making my own decisions, following my own schedule, answering to no one. I was solving my own problems, big and small. I was learning to rely on myself, to trust my own instincts. I was slowly, painstakingly, redefining myself, not by his absence, but by my own powerful, undeniable presence. The woman speaking to you today is not the same woman who shattered into a million pieces on that living room floor. Pain was my harshest, most relentless teacher, and solitude became my most honest and loyal companion. In that quiet space, I was forced to confront my deepest fears and my greatest strengths. I learned the most important lesson of my life. My worth was never his to give or take away. It was never tied to being chosen, to being a wife, to being one half of a whole. My worth is intrinsic, it is non-negotiable, and it is all mine. The trade-in that was meant to destroy me, in the end, set me free. It set me free from a love that required me to be smaller so he could feel bigger. It set me free from a life that was comfortable but had stopped me from growing. I have built my own fortress now, not on the shifting sands of another person's loyalty, but on the solid bedrock of my own self-love, my own resilience, and my own hard-won peace. The scars are still there, I see them, but they are no longer marks of shame. They are the roadmap of the incredible journey I took to find my way back to myself. This is the journey of a woman who was traded in, but who, in the process, traded her own pain for power, her fear for freedom, and the shadow for her own light. And that light, today, shines brighter than ever before. It's funny how memories work, how they can feel so solid, so real, like a photograph you can hold in your hands, only to discover later that the image was incomplete. My first memory of him is like that. It's bathed in the golden light of a late summer afternoon. We met at a friend's barbecue, the kind where the air smells like freshly cut grass and charcoal, and the laughter of people you love is the only soundtrack you need. It wasn't a lightning strike, it wasn't a scene from a movie, it was quieter, and in a way, more profound. I saw him from across the yard talking to a friend. He wasn't the life of the party, not the one telling loud jokes and commanding attention. He had this stillness about him, a calm, centered energy in the middle of all the happy chaos. He was leaning against an old oak tree, listening intently to whoever was speaking, and when he smiled, it was this slow, genuine curve of his lips that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. I remember thinking, that's a kind smile. When we were finally introduced, that was the first thing I noticed up close, his kindness. It was in his eyes. He shook my hand, and he didn't let go right away. He just held it for a second, longer than necessary, and said, "It's really nice to meet you." But he said it like he actually meant it. In a world of fleeting connections and divided attention, he made me feel like I was the only person in that crowded backyard. He asked me questions about my life, my dreams. Not as small talk, but with a curiosity that felt like a gift. He listened. Truly listened. And when I spoke, he'd nod, his gaze never leaving mine. I felt seen. I felt important. That was his magic. That was what drew me in. He had this way of making the whole world quiet down, leaving just the two of you in a bubble of perfect understanding. In those early days, he was everything you read about in books, everything you hope for when you're young and dreaming of the future. He was my rock. He was ambitious but not ruthless, confident but not arrogant. He seemed to carry this unshakable moral compass, a deep-seated sense of right and wrong. He'd talk about the importance of loyalty, of having someone's back no matter what. He'd say things like, "It's us against the world," and I believed him. I leaned on that. He was the man who would call my mom just to check in, who would stop to help a stranger change a flat tire, who would remember a tiny detail I'd mentioned weeks ago and bring it up again. He was building a case, brick by careful brick, that he was a safe harbor, a man you could build a life with. And I was buying every bit of it, because I had no reason not to. He was my certainty in a world full of questions. I can pinpoint the exact moment I knew I was going to spend the rest of my life with him. It wasn't on a fancy date or during a grand romantic gesture. It was about 6 months in, on a miserable, rainy Tuesday. I had come down with a terrible flu, the kind that makes you feel like you're a ghost in your own body. I was miserable, weak, and felt utterly alone in my small apartment. I'd sent him a text telling him not to come over, that I was contagious and looked awful. About an hour later, my buzzer rang. It was him. He was standing there in the pouring rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, holding 2 grocery bags. He didn't even wait for me to protest. He just came in, took off his wet jacket, and said, "Go get back in bed. I've got this." For the rest of the day, he took care of me. He made me soup from scratch, making the whole apartment smell like home. He went to the pharmacy to get me medicine. He put on my favorite old movie, the one I'd told him about once, and sat on the edge of the bed, just keeping me company. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was just there, present. Solid. Later that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I remember opening my eyes and seeing him asleep in the uncomfortable armchair he'd pulled up next to my bed. He had a book open on his lap, and his head was tilted to the side. In that quiet, simple moment, watching him sleep there, a wave of certainty washed over me that was so powerful, it felt like a physical force. This was it. This was the man who would show up, even in the rain. This was the man who would take care of me when I was at my worst. This was the foundation I could build my entire world on. It was a promise, unspoken but perfectly clear, of a future filled with that kind of unwavering care and devotion. And I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face, completely, blissfully, and foolishly unaware that the strongest-looking foundations can be built on nothing more than sand. The transition from if to when was seamless, almost imperceptible. After that rainy Tuesday when he cared for me, there was a new gravity between us, a silent understanding that we were no longer two separate people exploring a connection, but two halves of a future that was already taking shape. The question wasn't if we would get married, but simply when and how he would ask. He did it a year later, on a crisp autumn evening. He took me back to the park with the old oak tree, the place where we'd had our first real conversation. The air smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves, and the sunset was painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. We were walking, our hands intertwined, talking about nothing and everything, the way we always did. He stopped under the branches of that same tree, the one he'd been leaning against when I first saw him. He turned to face me, and that calm, centered energy I had first noticed was now focused entirely on me. He didn't have a long, rehearsed speech. He just took both of my hands in his and looked at me with an intensity that made my heart pound. He said, "From the moment I met you right here, I felt like I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for. You make everything make sense. You're my home." Then he got down on one knee, the fallen leaves crunching beneath him, and he opened a small, simple box. "I want to build my whole life with you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" And in that golden light, with the whole world feeling hushed and holy, I said yes. It wasn't a decision, it was a recognition of something that was already true. Our wedding was less of a party, and more of a promise made public. It was a small ceremony, surrounded by the people who had watched our love grow. I remember standing across from him, looking into those kind eyes, and feeling a sense of absolute peace. This was it. This was my safe harbor. The first few years of our marriage were the blueprint of the life we were so sure of. We were a team, a unit. We bought our first house, a small place with a crooked porch and a backyard big enough for a dog we planned to get one day. We spent our weekends painting walls, planting a garden, and turning that house into a home. Our life was a tapestry woven from 1,000 tiny, happy moments. It was him bringing me coffee in bed every single morning. It was me leaving notes in his lunch. It was slow dancing in the kitchen to a song on the radio while dinner was cooking. Our dreams were shared, spoken of so often they felt like foregone conclusions. We had a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. We'd travel to Italy, rent a villa in Tuscany. We'd have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He'd make partner at his firm. I'd finally write that novel. We'd sit on our crooked porch in rocking chairs when we were old and gray. And we'd have a lifetime of these moments to look back on. We weren't just living a life. We were consciously, deliberately building one, brick by careful brick. And the foundation felt like solid rock. If I had to choose one single memory, one snapshot in time, that represented the absolute peak of that love, it would be from our 3rd anniversary. We took a trip to the coast of Maine, to a tiny town with a rocky shoreline and a single lighthouse that swept its beam across our window at night. One afternoon, we hiked out to a deserted stretch of beach. The sky was a vast, brilliant blue, and the waves crashed against the shore with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. We sat on a weathered piece of driftwood for hours, not saying much, just watching the ocean. The air was salty and clean. I leaned my head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around me, pulling me in close. I felt so completely safe, so utterly cherished. The entire world seemed to fade away until it was just us, the sky, and the sea. After a long, comfortable silence, he turned his head and kissed my hair. He whispered, "You know, this is all I'll ever need. Right here, just this. And I looked up at him, at his profile against the endless blue horizon, and I believed him with every cell in my body. It was a moment of perfect, unshakable certainty. I held that moment in my heart like a precious stone, something I would take out and look at in the years to come. It was my proof, my evidence. It was the memory of a love so profound, so absolute, I was sure nothing on earth could ever break it. It was the highest turret on the castle we had built, a vantage point from which I couldn't see the storm that was already gathering, far, far out at sea. It's a strange thing, the beginning of the end. It doesn't arrive with a thunderclap. It's more like a change in air pressure before a storm you can't yet see. You just feel a heaviness, a quiet wrongness. For us, the barometer started to drop the year he made partner at his firm. On the surface, it was everything we had worked for. It was the culmination of our 5-year plan. We celebrated with champagne, the expensive kind. And I remember looking at him across our dining room table, his face glowing with success, and feeling a surge of pride so fierce it almost hurt. This was our victory, but that victory came with a price I didn't know we were paying. The promotion changed the logistics of our life first. The late nights became later. The weekend work trips became more frequent. At first, I embraced the role of the supportive wife. I'd have dinner waiting for him, no matter how late. I'd listen for hours as he talked about office politics, new clients, the immense pressure he was under. I told myself, this is temporary. This is what success looks like. But the man who came home to me was slowly being replaced by a stranger. The easy intimacy that had been the bedrock of our marriage began to erode. The laughter faded first. Our conversations became transactional, about bills, about schedules, about household chores. The empty spaces between our words grew wider and colder. He'd sit on the couch next to me, scrolling endlessly on his phone, and I could have been 1,000 miles away. I remember reaching out to touch his arm one night, and he flinched, almost imperceptibly, like my touch had startled him out of another world. He apologized quickly. Sorry, just lost in thought. But I felt it. A door had been closed, and I was on the wrong side of it. That was when the gaslighting began, so subtly that I didn't even have a name for it then. When I would try to talk to him, to voice the ache of loneliness I felt living in the same house, my feelings were dismissed, repackaged, and handed back to me as my own failing. I'd say, I miss you. I feel like we're disconnected. And he would sigh, a heavy, weary sound, and say, you know the pressure I'm under. I really need you to be my partner in this, not another source of stress. Or worse, are you feeling insecure? I'm doing all of this for us, for our future. He was a master at it. He could make my legitimate pain sound like a childish complaint. He made me feel needy, ungrateful, and eventually, crazy. I started to question my own reality. Maybe he was right. Maybe I stopped the problem. And then there was the phone. His phone became a third person in our marriage. A silent, malevolent presence. It lived face down on the nightstand, on the kitchen counter, on the table between us. It was locked down like a fortress. One evening he was in the shower, and his phone, which he'd left on the coffee table, buzzed. It was an instinct, a muscle memory from the years when we had no secrets. I reached for it. And in that split second, he was out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, his hair dripping, and he lunged for it. He snatched it from the table before my fingers could even touch it. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was panic. Pure, animal panic. He saw the shock on my face and immediately tried to cover his tracks. It's a huge deal at work, he said, his voice tight. I'm waiting on an important email. I can't miss it. He was breathing heavily. But the lie hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. It wasn't about work. In that moment, I knew. I didn't know a name or a face, but I knew. The shadow I had been feeling for months finally had a source. It was coming from that small, glowing rectangle he was now clutching like a lifeline. The unraveling began in earnest after that. My intuition, the part of me he had tried so hard to silence, was now on high alert. I became a detective in my own home, a ghost haunting the ruins of my own marriage. I started noticing things I had previously chosen to ignore. The way he'd suddenly started guarding the credit card statements, insisting he'd, quote, take care of the bills from now on. The new cologne he started wearing. The gym membership he was suddenly using at odd hours of the night. The first piece of concrete evidence was a receipt. It fell out of his coat pocket as I was hanging it up. A receipt from a jewelry store. For a delicate gold necklace. My birthday was months away. Our anniversary had just passed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt sick. I left it on his pillow that night without a word. The next morning he came downstairs, his face a mask of casual nonchalance. "Oh, you found that," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I bought it for my mom. Her birthday is coming up." It was another lie, so smooth, so effortless. I knew his mother's birthday. It wasn't for 3 more months. And she never wore gold. The real confirmation, the moment the floor fell out from under me, came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He was on a business trip. I was working from home, and our Wi-Fi went out. I went into his home office to reset the router. Our family tablet was on his desk, something we rarely used. I picked it up to move it, and the screen lit up. His messages were synced to it, and there it was. Not just one message, but a thread. A conversation stretching back for months. I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled. The room started to spin. I sank into his office chair, my legs too weak to hold me. And I read everything. I read the pet names he had for her. Names he used to call me. I read about their secret lunches, their weekends away disguised as work trips. I read their plans for the future. A future that didn't include me. There were photos. Her, smiling at him from across a candlelit dinner table. Them, standing close together, his arm wrapped around her, on a beach I didn't recognize. Every word was a physical blow. I was reading the script of the double life he had been living while I was at home, keeping our life running, worrying about his stress, blaming myself for our distance. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just a physical affair. It was a completely separate, fully formed, emotional relationship. He had built a new life, a new love, in the shadows of the one we had. I sat there for hours, I think. The rain beat against the window pane, the only sound in the house. I felt a coldness spread through me, so profound it felt like it was turning my bones to ice. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was annihilation. The woman in those messages, the one he described with such passion and admiration, was everything I wasn't. She was exciting, spontaneous, a breath of fresh air. He was building her up by tearing me down, piece by piece. The foundation of our life, the one I thought was solid rock built on his kindness and devotion, was revealed to be nothing but a hollow stage set. And I had been the unwitting actress, playing a part in a play whose real story was happening just off stage, hidden from my view. The betrayal was absolute. It didn't just break my heart. It broke my reality. It broke my past, my present, and every single dream I had for the future. He came home 3 hours later to a dark, silent house. He must have sensed it, the shift in the atmosphere, the way the very air had become heavy and brittle. He found me still sitting in his office chair, the tablet on the desk in front of me, its screen dark. I hadn't moved. I had just sat there as the afternoon bled into evening, watching the truth replay itself behind my eyes. He stopped in the doorway. He didn't ask what was wrong. He saw the tablet, and he knew. The mask of the devoted husband, the stressed-out partner, it didn't just slip, it evaporated. In its place was the face of a stranger, weary, resigned, and utterly devoid of the kindness I had first fallen in love with. "So you know," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I finally looked at him, really looked at him. And I saw the man from the confession he hadn't yet made. I saw the relief that he was about to be unburdened. That was the final straw. It wasn't the messages themselves. It was the complete and total absence of remorse in his eyes. He wasn't sorry he had done it. He was just sorry he'd been caught. My voice, when it came out, was a whisper, raspy from hours of unshed tears. All this time. He leaned against the doorframe and gave me the cold, clinical summary I had already read on the screen. He talked about her, about their connection, about how he hadn't meant for it to happen, but it did. He didn't apologize. He explained. he justified. He laid out the narrative of our dying marriage as if it were a business merger that had failed, and he was simply moving on to a more profitable venture. He made it clear that this wasn't a mistake, it was a choice, a better choice. In that moment, a strange, cold calm settled over me. The grief was still there, a massive black hole in my chest. But alongside it grew something else. Clarity. The screaming intuition I had silenced for so long was now the only voice in my head, and it was speaking with perfect, chilling precision. There was nothing left to fight for. The man I had married was a ghost, and the man standing in front of me was a stranger who had stolen his face. I stood up, my legs shaking but holding. "I want a divorce," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign language. But they were also the truest words I had spoken in years. I said them. Not him. It was the first decision I had made for my own future, without him, in over a decade. His reaction was the final, twisting turn of the knife. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't even look sad. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a long, slow breath escaped his lips. It was the breath of a man who had been holding his own for a very long time, waiting for an ordeal to be over. It was the sound of relief. He opened his eyes and just nodded. "Okay," he said. "Just okay." The days that followed were a surreal exercise in dismantling a life. He moved into the guest room, and we became polite, silent roommates navigating the geography of our shared home like two ghosts. We spoke only of logistics. We divided our lives with the same detachment we would use to divide a list of household chores. "You take this couch. I'll take that one. Who gets the wedding china?" The question hung in the air, a monument to its own absurdity. Telling our families was like dropping a bomb into a quiet garden. There was shock, disbelief, and a flood of questions I couldn't answer. My parents' sorrow was a weight I had to carry on top of my own. His parents were polite but distant, their loyalty already transferred to their son's new life. Friends took sides, some with awkward, pitying glances, others with fierce, protective anger on my behalf. I felt like a spectacle, the subject of whispered conversations, my private agony turned into public gossip. The legal process was, mercifully, not a battle. He didn't want to fight, he just wanted to be free. Our divorce was mediated, a series of meetings in a sterile, beige conference room, with a kind-faced woman who guided us through the paperwork of our undoing. There were no children to fight over, thank God, just assets. A house, cars, a savings account. We sat across from each other at a polished mahogany table, two business partners dissolving a company. He was agreeable to everything. He was generous, even. It wasn't kindness. It was guilt, paid out in dollars and cents. A severance package for a decade of my life. The hardest day was the one where we had to go through the house with a realtor to have it appraised for the sale. I had to walk through each room, the backdrop of our entire life together, and listen to a stranger talk about resale value and staging. She'd point to the kitchen where we danced and say, "A backsplash update here would really help." She stood in our bedroom, the place where we had shared our deepest intimacies and dreams, and suggested a neutral coat of paint to appeal to more buyers. I felt like I was being erased. My life, my memories, my home were being stripped down to their studs, repackaged for someone else. The day we signed the final papers was gray and overcast, the weather a perfect match for my soul. We met at the lawyer's office. We didn't speak in the waiting room. By then, there was nothing left to say. We were called into another conference room, another mahogany table. The lawyer laid the thick stack of papers between us. He slid them over to me first. I picked up the heavy, black pen. I stared at the line next to my name. This was it. The final, legal severing. My hand was shaking. I thought of our wedding day, of the hopeful, naive girl who had signed her name on a marriage license, so sure of her forever. I thought of the man I had loved, the one who made me soup in the rain, the one who held me on a beach in Maine and told me I was all he would ever need. A single tear escaped and fell onto the page, smudging the ink of the paragraph above my signature line. I looked up at him one last time, searching for a flicker of that man. But he was gone. He was just looking at the papers, his expression impatient. He was already somewhere else. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was letting go of a ghost. I took a deep breath, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed my name. the name that was once ours, and was now, once again, just mine. As I wrote the last letter, I felt a strange and contradictory mix of emotions. There was the crushing weight of sorrow for the life I had lost. There was the terrifying fear of a future that was now a complete and utter blank. But beneath it all, so quiet I could barely hear it, was a tiny, fragile whisper of relief. The end of my story. The beginning of mine. The first morning I woke up in my new apartment, the silence was so loud it felt like it was screaming. For years, my mornings had been a duet. The sound of his shower running while the coffee maker brewed, the quiet murmur of our plans for the day. Now, there was just nothing. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart in an empty room. I was officially divorced. I was officially free. And I had never felt more lost in my life. Those first few months were a masterclass in the art of just getting through the day. Loneliness wasn't an emotion. It was a physical presence. It was the empty passenger seat in my car. It was the other side of the bed, cold and impossibly vast. It was the instinctive turn to share a funny thought with someone who wasn't there. But alongside that suffocating grief, a tiny, unfamiliar feeling began to sprout. Freedom. It was terrifying. It was the freedom to eat cereal for dinner without judgment, the freedom to paint a wall a color he would have hated, the freedom to take up the entire bed. These were small, flickering lights in a vast darkness, but they were lights nonetheless. Healing wasn't a straight line, it was a messy, chaotic dance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Some days I felt strong, capable. Other days, a song on the radio would send me into a spiral, and I'd spend the evening on the floor, crying. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I found a therapist, a woman with kind eyes who didn't offer platitudes. She gave me tools. She helped me understand that the trade-in wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a reflection of his weakness. She helped me see the gaslighting for the emotional abuse it was. In that safe space, I learned to grieve not just the man I lost, but the man I thought he was. And I began the slow, painful work of untangling my identity from his. I started saying yes. Yes to that dance class where I felt foolish and uncoordinated, but also alive in my own body for the first time in years. Yes to coffee with an old friend who reminded me of the girl I was before I became a we. Yes to a promotion at work that I would have turned down before because it would have demanded too much of my time. Each yes was an act of reclamation. I was taking back the territory of my own life, 1 square inch at a time. Today, my life looks nothing like it did before, and I mean that in the most beautiful way possible. I live in a small apartment in a neighborhood, buzzing with life. It's filled with things that make me happy, overflowing bookshelves, plants reaching for the sunlight, and art that I chose, for no other reason than because I loved it. My routine is my own. Some mornings I wake up early and go for a run as the sun rises. Other mornings, I stay in bed with a cup of tea and a good book until noon. My time belongs to me. The woman I am now is fundamentally different. I'm calmer, I'm more centered. I learned that I am my own safe harbor. The most profound change is that I finally, completely trust myself. That primal intuition I spent years silencing? It's now my loudest and most trusted advisor. I learned that I am capable of weathering the most violent of storms and coming out the other side, not just intact, but stronger. I learned that being alone is not the same thing as being lonely. In fact, in the solitude, I found the best company I've ever kept, my own. People often ask if I've forgiven him. It's a complicated question. I don't think I will ever forgive the cruelty, the calculated deception. To forgive that would be to dishonor the woman who suffered through it. But I have forgiven the situation. I have released the anger and the bitterness, not for his sake, but for mine. I had to, because holding on to that rage was like drinking poison and waiting for him to die. It was chaining me to a past that was over. The most important forgiveness, though, was for myself. I forgave myself for not seeing the signs, for believing the lies, for loving someone who was not capable of loving me back with the same integrity. As for the future, for the first time in my life, it feels like an open road instead of a pre-drawn map. Am I open to love again? Yes, absolutely. But my perspective has changed. I am not looking for someone to complete me, because I am already whole. I am not looking for a man to build a castle with. I have already built my own fortress, right here, inside myself. If someone comes along who is worthy of being invited inside, who wants to build his own fortress next to mine, I will welcome that. But my happiness is no longer contingent on it. My life is full. It's full of friendship, and purpose, and quiet joy, and the simple, profound peace of knowing that no matter what happens, I will be okay. I am my own foundation. I am my own light, and my story, the real one, is just getting started. If I could reach back through time and speak to that woman, the one I used to be, standing in the ruins of her life, her hands trembling as she packed her world into cardboard boxes, what would I say? First, I would just hold her. I would let her sob until she had no tears left, and then I would look her in the eyes and tell her to breathe. Just breathe. I would tell her that the crushing weight on her chest, the one that feels like it's going to stop her heart, is grief. And it's okay to let it break her, because she will not stay broken. I would tell her that this is not her failure, that his betrayal is a map of his own broken compass, not a measure of her worth. I'd tell her that all the love she poured into him wasn't wasted. It was practice. It was her heart showing her its own incredible capacity. A capacity she will one day learn to turn inward, on herself. And I would whisper to her in the long, silent nights, when the fear is a monster under the bed, you are not being erased. You are being cleared. The life you think you've lost was just the training ground for the life that is waiting to find you. And to you, if you are listening to this right now, and my story echoes in the chambers of your own heart, if you are standing in the wreckage of a life you thought was forever, please hear me. Your pain is real. The betrayal is a wound that cuts to the soul. Do not let anyone, especially the person who hurt you, tell you that you are overreacting or being too sensitive. Your grief is the price of your love, and you must honor it. Let it move through you. Cry, scream, fall to your knees, but do not build a home there. Do not let their shadow become the permanent landscape of your future. The journey back to yourself will be the hardest thing you ever do. It will be lonely. It will demand a courage you don't think you have. But you do. It's there, buried under the rubble of what was. You just have to start digging. Start small. One class. One phone call to a friend you've lost touch with. One walk in the sun without your phone. One meal you cook just for you, and savor every bite. These small acts of defiance, these moments where you choose yourself over the memory of them, these are the bricks you will use to build your new home, a fortress inside yourself that no one can ever tear down again. Here is the great, secret truth that I had to bleed to learn. You were never an object to be traded in. You are not a house that can be foreclosed on, or a contract that can be voided. You are not half of a whole. You were born whole. You will die whole. Your worth is the one thing that was never part of the deal. It is intrinsic. It is absolute. And it is non-negotiable. The love you are looking for, the safety you crave, is not in another person's validation. It's in the way you learn to speak to yourself with kindness. It's in the promises you learn to keep to yourself. It's in the profound, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you can face the storm alone, because you are not the storm. You are the sky it passes through. Your story does not end with their betrayal. That was not the end. That was the plot twist. It was the end of their story with you. But it is the very, very beginning of your story with yourself. So turn the page. Pick up the pen. Your greatest work, your most beautiful chapter, is not behind you. It's waiting to be written.